At a black-tie gala gathering 300 of the most powerful people in the country, billionaire Charles Whitmore did something no one in that room expected. He stood at the center of it all and publicly humiliated his own daughter, calling her husband a broke, washed-up single father from the wrong side of the city, demanding she end the marriage before the night was over. For months, he had been poisoning every room with that same story, but no one in that ballroom knew what was about to walk through the door and why the moment Ryan Carter entered the entire room went silent. The Whitmore name meant something in this city. It had meant something for decades, printed on the sides of buildings attached to hospital wings, spoken in boardrooms with a kind of reverence that most families never earned and never would. Charles Whitmore had not inherited that name so much as he had sharpened it into something harder and more permanent than any inheritance could be. He had built his fortune from a company his father left half-finished, turned it into an empire that touched real estate technology and private equity across 4 continents, and made sure that everyone who mattered knew exactly where the Whitmore family stood. Not above the law, above the conversation. Eleanor had grown up inside that name, the way a person grows up inside a house, aware of its walls, aware of what it kept out and what it demanded in return. She had attended the right schools, worn the right things to the right events, smiled beside her father at galas exactly like this one. She had not resented it, not entirely because there was a version of her life that fit that shape, and she had lived it without too much friction for a long time. But Eleanor was also the kind of person who noticed things the way the household staff moved quietly around her father's moods, the way guests laughed a half-second after Charles laughed, never before, never independently. She noticed the machinery of it, and somewhere in her mid-20s, she had started to want something that didn't run on that engine. Ryan Carter was not what her father would have chosen. That was clear from the first conversation from the first dinner, where Charles sat across from Ryan and asked him questions the way a prosecutor asks questions, not to learn, but to confirm what he already believed. Ryan had answered everything plainly. He didn't perform confidence, and he didn't shrink either. He just answered, and that plainness seemed to irritate Charles more than arrogance would have. Arrogance Charles understood. He spoke that language fluently, but a man who didn't need to impress him, that was something Charles had no framework for. Ryan had come from the kind of neighborhood that Charles referenced only in speeches about opportunity and hard work, always from a safe rhetorical distance. He had worked since he was a teenager, had built a stable life through years of unglamorous effort, and had gone through a marriage that didn't survive, and came out the other side quieter and more deliberate than he'd been before. He wasn't carrying bitterness about it. He had simply learned things the hard way and kept moving. Eleanor had recognized that quality in him before she could name it a kind of settled honesty that didn't require an audience. They had met at a friend's dinner party, the kind of low-key evening that didn't make it into any social column, and Eleanor had spent most of it talking to Ryan in a corner of the kitchen while the rest of the party moved around them. He had asked her what she actually wanted to do with her life, not what the Whitmore Foundation was funding next, not what she thought about the new development on the East Side. What she wanted. She remembered being briefly thrown by the question, not because it was difficult, but because so few people in her circle had ever asked it without immediately following it up with a suggestion. Ryan had just waited for her answer. She had liked that. She had kept liking it, and eventually that liking had become something she wasn't willing to let go of. Charles had made his disapproval known early and had never walked it back. He called Ryan a poor choice, then a poor investment, then simply poor the last one delivered once in a private conversation, and once more casually over drinks with colleagues, as if it were a financial assessment rather than a judgment about a person. Eleanor had heard about the second instance through a mutual acquaintance. She had confronted her father about it. Charles had not apologized. He had told her she was being sensitive, that he was simply being realistic, that a man like Ryan Carter would never understand the weight of what the Whitmore name carried, or what it required. Eleanor had said very little in response. She had learned by that point that arguing with her father in the early stages of one of his positions was pointless. He needed time to exhaust the position before he could hear anything else, but he had not exhausted it. Over the months that followed, the position had only calcified. Charles had told the story of Ryan's past in enough rooms and enough variations that it had taken on the smooth, rehearsed quality of a prepared remark. He knew which details landed the failed marriage, the working-class background, the absence of any meaningful professional prestige. He deployed them efficiently, always framed as concern, always wrapped in the language of a father who only wanted the best for his daughter. Eleanor heard versions of it secondhand from people who had no idea she was listening. She stopped correcting them after a while. She waited. The annual gala was Charles Whitmore's event in every sense. He had hosted it for 11 years, always at the same downtown venue, always with the same caliber of guest list politicians, executives, philanthropists, people whose presence at an event was itself a form of currency. The evening had a format cocktails on the terrace dinner in the main ballroom, a brief program of remarks and recognition, then another 2 hours of the kind of networking that was never called networking because everyone there was too important to admit that's what they were doing. It ran like a machine. Charles liked machines. Eleanor had attended every year since she was old enough to be introduced as a full participant rather than a daughter on display. This year, she arrived alone because Ryan had called an hour before to tell her he would be late. Something had come up, something he needed to handle personally before he could leave. He had apologized. She had told him it was fine, and she meant it because it was fine. She knew him well enough to know that if he said he'd be there, he would be there. She went in without him. The terrace was already full when she arrived. The air carried the particular smell of expensive evenings, floral arrangements catered warmth, the faint overlay of competing colognes and perfumes worn by people who had staff to help them choose. Eleanor moved through the space with the ease of someone who had done it 100 times, accepting greetings, keeping conversations brief and pleasant, watching the room operate the way she had always watched it. She was good at this. She had been trained for it the way other people are trained for other professions. Charles found her near the bar. He was already in full form, animated, expansive, working the room with the practiced fluency of a man who genuinely enjoyed this kind of performance. He kissed her on the cheek, told her she looked beautiful, asked where Ryan was. Eleanor told him Ryan was running late. Something shifted in Charles's expression, not dramatically, but Eleanor caught it. She had been catching that shift her whole life. It was the expression her father made when something gave him an opening he had been waiting for. He let it go for the first hour. Dinner was served, the program began, and Charles delivered his annual remarks with the warmth and authority that always landed well in this room. He thanked the guests, recognized several individuals for their contributions, spoke briefly about the coming year's initiatives. He was good at it. Eleanor watched from her seat and felt the familiar ambivalence of admiring a skill and distrusting the person wielding it. Ryan's chair remained empty. It was during the post-program reception, when the formal structure of the evening had loosened and people were moving freely between conversations, that Charles began. Eleanor heard it first, from across the room, her father's voice carrying over the ambient noise with the deliberate projection of someone who wanted to be heard by more than just the person in front of him. He was standing with a group of 5 or 6 guests, men and women Eleanor recognized, people who sat on boards and ran divisions and made decisions that affected thousands of people who would never know their names. And Charles was telling them about Ryan. He was telling them, the way he always told it, as a story about his daughter's inexplicable choices, about how love made people temporarily irrational, about how he hoped Eleanor would come to her senses before too much was lost. He mentioned the working-class neighborhood, the failed marriage, the absence of what he called real professional standing. He said it all with the measured tone of a concerned father, which made it worse, because the measured tone gave every word the appearance of objectivity. He wasn't ranting. He was presenting evidence. Eleanor set down her glass and walked toward the group. She didn't move quickly. She moved the way she always moved in rooms like this, deliberately without urgency, because urgency in these spaces reads as weakness. She reached the edge of the group and waited long enough for several people to register her presence before she spoke. She said simply that Ryan was her husband, that she was proud of who he was, and that the version of him her father kept describing to people bore almost no resemblance to the actual man. She said it without raising her voice, without breaking eye contact with Charles, without offering the group any of the apologetic softness that might have let the moment pass more comfortably. She meant every word. She wanted them to know she meant it. Charles turned to look at her. The group went quiet in the specific way that groups go quiet when they sense that something real is happening, and they are uncertain whether to stay or drift away. Most of them stayed. Charles met Eleanor's gaze and held it, and she could see him recalibrating, not retreating, just choosing his next position with the speed of a man who had navigated public confrontations before. He told her that this was not the place for this conversation. Then he said that if she wanted to make choices that would define the rest of her life, she should at least make them with her eyes open. He said that a man who couldn't provide what the Whitmore family required was not a man who deserved to stand beside a Whitmore woman. He said the word deserved carefully, as if it were the most reasonable word in the language. Eleanor did not look away from him. She said that Ryan had never asked to stand beside a Whitmore. He had asked to stand beside her. She said there was a difference, and that her father had never understood it. Charles's jaw tightened. The group around them had stopped pretending to do anything else. Charles looked at his daughter, his only daughter, the one person in his life he had never been able to fully read. And then he looked at the empty chair across the room where Ryan was supposed to be sitting, and he made the decision that Eleanor had always known on some level he would eventually make. He told her that if she continued this marriage, she would lose her place in his plans. He meant the inheritance. He meant the foundation. He meant the future he had drawn out for the family in his own mind, with the same precision he applied to every asset he owned. He meant all of it, and Eleanor understood exactly what he meant, and she stood there in the middle of the room with the eyes of nearly every guest orbiting the conversation, and she looked at her father and told him that her answer was no. She was not leaving Ryan, not for this room, not for the Whitmore name, not for any version of the future her father was offering. She said it once, clearly, and then she stood still and waited to see what Charles would do next. Around them, the room continued its slow, careful orbit. Glasses lifted, conversations, murmured the machinery of the evening grinding forward, while something irreversible settled between a father and his daughter at the center of it all. Charles did not soften after Eleanor refused him. That was not how he operated. When Charles Whitmore encountered resistance, he didn't retreat. He expanded, pushing outward with more force and more certainty, until the resistance either collapsed or was absorbed into the broader argument he was making. Eleanor had watched him do it in business negotiations and family conversations alike. She had always known it was coming. What she hadn't fully calculated was how much room a ballroom full of powerful guests gave him to do it in. Within minutes of her refusal, Charles had moved away from the original group and was circulating again, not frantically, not visibly agitated, but with a focused energy that Eleanor recognized as something more deliberate than his usual gala rhythm. He was working. He moved from cluster to cluster with the smooth efficiency of a man who understood that influence in a room like this was not about volume, but about repetition, the same story told to enough people in enough corners until it became the room's consensus reality. Eleanor watched him from across the ballroom and understood with a clarity that felt like cold water that her father was not going to let this go. Not tonight. not publicly. He was going to make this evening mean something on his terms, or not at all. She stayed where she was. Moving away would have looked like retreat. She accepted a glass from a passing server and kept her posture level, her expression composed, and she watched the room with the practiced stillness of someone who had learned over many years that showing nothing was sometimes the most effective thing you could do. But she was not made of stone. Underneath the composure, something was shifting. Not her certainty about Ryan. That was fixed, but her understanding of what this night was actually going to cost. The guests who approached her in the following half hour fell into two categories. The first were people who genuinely liked Eleanor, who sought her out with the slightly careful warmth of friends, who know a difficult situation is unfolding, and want to register their presence without saying anything that commits them to a position. They touched her arm. They said she looked lovely. They talked about things that had nothing to do with what was happening 6 feet away from them at any given moment. Eleanor appreciated them for trying, and she knew that most of them would not push back against Charles when he returned to them, because that was not the kind of loyalty this room ran on. The second category was harder. These were people who approached her with the specific manner of those who have already heard one version of a story and want to see how the subject responds. They asked about Ryan not cruelly, but with a precision that told Eleanor they had been recently briefed. How was he doing? Had he found more stable work? Did he find these sorts of evenings overwhelming given his background? The questions were dressed in politeness, so carefully pressed, it looked ironed. Eleanor answered each one with the same measured patience she had used with her father, and each time she watched the person absorb her answer and file it somewhere non-committal, and she understood that she was losing ground she couldn't see. Charles returned to the center of the room during the second hour of the reception. He did it the way he always did the most significant things, without apparent drama, simply by placing himself where everyone could see him and beginning to speak in a tone that assumed the room's attention rather than requesting it. The conversations nearby quieted first, then the ones further out, until the ambient noise of the ballroom had dropped enough that his voice was carrying clearly to most of the people present. Eleanor stood 40 feet away and did not move. He spoke about his daughter with the particular warmth of a man who wants his love for someone to function as proof that his cruelty toward them is justified. He said that Eleanor was the most important person in his life. He said that he had spent decades building something that was meant to outlast him, something that required the right foundation at every level. And then, with the smoothness of a transition he had clearly rehearsed, he shifted into Ryan, into the specific, constructed version of Ryan that he had been circulating for months and had now refined into something almost airtight. He said that any honest person in the room would recognize what Ryan Carter represented: a man without means, without professional standing, without the experience or capacity to understand what it meant to be part of a family like theirs. He said this not with contempt. Contempt would have been easier to argue against, but with the measured sorrow of a man delivering a diagnosis he wishes were different. He said that Ryan had entered Eleanor's life at a moment when she was looking for something real, and that he understood the appeal of simplicity. He truly did. But that simplicity was not the same thing as strength, and mistaking one for the other was how people ended up in situations they couldn't recover from. Then he said the thing that changed the temperature of the room. He said that no man without means marries into wealth without understanding exactly what he's marrying into. He said it as if it were self-evident, as if he were simply reading from a ledger of human nature that everyone present had access to, but had been too polite to consult. He said that Ryan Carter had seen the Whitmore name and made a calculation, and that his daughter, who he loved more than anything in this world, had confused that calculation for something genuine. Eleanor's grip on her glass tightened. Not because the accusation was new, Charles had implied it privately before, but because hearing it spoken aloud in this room, in front of these people, with that tone of calm certainty, was a different thing entirely. It was one thing to know your father believed something damaging about your marriage. It was another to stand in a crowded ballroom and hear him present that belief as objective fact to people who trusted his judgment on most things and had no particular reason to question it on this. She wanted to speak. She had spoken once already, and she could speak again, but she was aware with the strategic instincts she had inherited from the man currently dismantling her husband's character across the room that speaking in anger, or in what would read as anger, would only confirm the narrative her father was building. The narrative in which Eleanor was a woman who had made an emotional decision and was now emotionally defending it, while the cooler, more rational voice in the room explained the reality of the situation. She held still. She breathed. She waited, but the waiting was its own cost, because the room, which had been uncertain 20 minutes ago, was beginning to settle. Not into hostility. These were not hostile people, but into the particular kind of comfortable agreement that forms when a powerful, credible, emotionally intelligent speaker presents a position without opposition for long enough. People were nodding, not all of them, not the ones who knew Eleanor well, or who had their own reasons to be skeptical of Charles's version of anything, but enough that Eleanor could feel the room's center of gravity shifting, and she could feel herself standing on the wrong side of it. A woman named Patricia, someone Eleanor had known since childhood, a longtime friend of Charles's, who sat on 2 of the same boards and had attended every one of these galas for as long as Eleanor could remember, came to stand beside her. Patricia was not unkind. She put a hand on Eleanor's shoulder and said in a low voice that was clearly meant to be private, but wasn't quite, that sometimes loving someone and choosing someone were 2 different things, and that Eleanor was young enough to course correct without it costing her everything. She said it gently. She meant it genuinely. Eleanor looked at her and felt something crack, not because the words were cruel, but because they were well-intentioned, and well-intentioned pressure from people who cared about her was infinitely harder to stand against than her father's direct opposition. She thanked Patricia and stepped away. She moved to the edge of the room near the tall windows and stood there with the city spread out below her, ordinary and indifferent, and going about its business the way cities do. What she felt in that moment was not doubt about Ryan. It was something more specific and harder to name, the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who had known you your entire life and still could not see what you were actually standing in front of. That was what her father had accomplished tonight. Not hostility, erasure. The slow, methodical replacement of the real Ryan Carter with a version that fit more comfortably into the story Charles needed to tell. Charles had not looked at her directly in the last 15 minutes. That was intentional, too. He had delivered his verdict and was now simply letting the room absorb it, trusting the social architecture of the evening to do the rest of the work. He was talking to a group near the center of the ballroom, laughing at ease, performing the ease of a man who has resolved something that needed resolving and can now return to enjoying himself. Eleanor watched him and tried to locate, somewhere in the man, she was looking at the father who had carried her on his shoulders at the beach when she was small, who had sat on the edge of her bed when she was sick and read to her until she fell asleep. She could find him distantly. That man had existed. But this man had existed longer and was more practiced and had learned somewhere along the way to use love the way he used everything else as leverage. The announcement, when it came, was not dramatic. It didn't need to be. Charles had already done the dramatic work. What remained was administrative. He gathered himself near the center of the room, and in a voice that carried without straining, he said that there were some things a father owed the people he cared about most, and honesty was one of them. He said that, as of this evening, he was making clear that the Whitmore estate and the foundation, and all associated plans for succession would be restructured to reflect the reality of his family as it currently stood. He did not say Eleanor's name. He didn't have to. everyone in the room understood what he meant, and Eleanor understood it most of all. The guests nearest to her went quiet in a way that felt deliberate. The way people go quiet when they are trying to give someone privacy in a room where privacy doesn't exist. Eleanor did not cry. She looked across the ballroom at her father, and she thought about every conversation they had ever had, about what family meant, about what it was built on, about what it was supposed to withstand. She had believed until fairly recently that it could withstand this, that Charles would push hard and then eventually pull back the way he always had with her, because she was the one person he never fully wrote off. She had believed that. She was less certain of it now. The room was watching her. Not everyone, not obviously, but she could feel it, the peripheral attention of hundreds of guests who had just witnessed something that would be discussed for the next several weeks in boardrooms and at dinner tables and in the kinds of low-voiced conversations that this city ran on. She was standing at the edge of it alone, in a dress she had chosen for a different kind of evening, and the chair across the room where Ryan was supposed to be sitting was still empty. And then the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened. The sound of them, the particular weight and swing of the main entrance doors, the slight change in the room's air pressure reached Eleanor before she turned. But she turned, and the rest of the room turned, with her drawn by the same instinct that draws any crowd toward the point of most tension. And Ryan Carter walked in. He was not rushing. He was not performing. He moved the way he always moved, with the unhurried certainty of a man who knows where he is going and sees no reason to announce himself before he gets there. He was dressed well, not formally, but with the kind of clean simplicity that sits differently in a room full of people trying too hard. His eyes found Eleanor immediately across the full length of the ballroom, and what passed between them in that moment was not a question. He had heard. Not everything, perhaps, but enough. It was in the set of his jaw, the way he took the room in without flinching, the way his gaze moved from Eleanor to Charles, and settled there with a steadiness that said he was not surprised, and he was not going anywhere. The room held its breath. Everyone who had been listening to Charles Whitmore for the past 2 hours was now looking at the man Charles Whitmore had been describing, and whatever they had expected to see, whatever image the words broke, washed up, calculated, had assembled in their minds, the man standing in the doorway was not it. Nobody moved first. That was the thing Eleanor would remember most clearly afterward, not what was said, not even Ryan's face when he walked in, but the stillness that settled over the room in the seconds between his entrance and whatever was going to happen next. The ballroom had been running on Charles Whitmore's energy all evening, absorbing his rhythm and his certainty. And now that energy had nowhere to go, because the subject of it had just walked through the door and was standing in the middle of it, with the composure of a man who had no idea he was supposed to be diminished. Ryan crossed the ballroom toward Eleanor first. He didn't look at Charles. He didn't survey the room or register the attention with anything more than the brief functional awareness of a man walking through a crowded space. He reached Eleanor, looked at her directly, and asked quietly if she was all right. She said yes, and she meant it more than she expected to, because something about his presence, the simple, grounded fact of him standing next to her, returned the room to its actual proportions. She had been standing at the edge of it, feeling like it was infinite. With Ryan beside her, it was just a room. Charles watched from across the ballroom. Eleanor could see him recalibrating again, the same micro-adjustment she had caught on his face earlier in the evening. But this time, accompanied by something she had rarely seen in him, a flicker of uncertainty about which move to make next. He had built the entire architecture of the evening around Ryan's absence. Ryan's presence was a structural problem. It was Charles who closed the distance. He moved through the room with his usual authority, the crowd parting slightly in the way that crowds part for people they are accustomed to deferring to. And he stopped a few feet from Ryan, with his shoulders square and his expression composed into something that was not quite hostility and not quite welcome. He said Ryan's name the way he said most things declaratively, as if the word itself were a position. Ryan turned to face him. He didn't adjust his posture or square up in any way that signaled confrontation. He simply turned the way a person turns when someone says their name, and looked at Charles with the same directness he brought to everything. He said, "Good evening." That was all. 2 words and the room somehow got quieter. Charles said that he was glad Ryan had finally arrived, that they had been having an important conversation this evening, one that concerned Ryan directly, and that since Ryan was now present, perhaps he'd like to respond to some of the things that had been discussed. There was an edge beneath it, not quite an invitation and not quite a challenge, the kind of framing that assumed the other person would either become defensive or retreat, and either outcome would confirm the point Charles had already made. Ryan said that he had actually heard most of it on his way in. He explained it simply. He had arrived at the venue about 20 minutes earlier than anyone in the room realized had been standing in the corridor outside the main hall while he finished a call, and the ballroom doors had been open the entire time. Voices carry in marble-floored hallways. He had heard enough to understand the shape of the evening. He said he wasn't offended. He said it without irony, just stated it as a fact, the way he stated most things. Charles said that he found that difficult to believe. He said that any man with a normal sense of pride would take exception to having his shortcomings discussed in a room full of people. He said the word, shortcomings, the way he said everything, as if it were neutral, clinical, inarguable. Ryan looked at him for a long moment before he answered. When he did, his voice was even, and what he said was not what anyone in the room was expecting. He said that Charles was right, that he had shortcomings. He said he had a long list of them, and that the people who knew him well could add to it without much effort. He said he had made serious mistakes in his life, had failed at things that mattered, had gone through a period where he was not the man he wanted to be, and had to rebuild that from the ground up with limited materials and no guarantee it would hold. He said all of this without performance, without the careful self-deprecation that functions as its own form of pride. He said it the way a person states the address of a house they used to live in as information, not confession. The room had gone fully silent. Not the polite quiet of a program segment, but the specific silence of people who came expecting theater and got something they didn't have a ready category for. Charles had not moved. His expression had not changed dramatically, but Eleanor, who had been reading that face her entire life, could see something shifting underneath it, a small, involuntary loosening around the jaw that meant he had not anticipated this particular response and did not yet have a counter prepared. Ryan continued. He said that the one thing he would push back on was the question of why he had married Eleanor. He said he understood why Charles had landed there, that it was the logical conclusion of a certain way of looking at the situation, a man with no money, no name, no obvious advantage, marrying a woman who had all 3. He said he understood the math of it, and he understood why a man who had built everything he had through precise calculation would assume everyone else was doing the same calculation. But he said that conclusion was wrong, and that he could say that with certainty because he had been the one sitting across from Eleanor at a kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night when she was exhausted and not performing anything for anyone, and he had known then, without ambiguity, that what he felt had nothing to do with what she came from. He said he would have married her if her last name meant nothing. He said that was not a romantic claim, it was just the truth, and he had no reason to dress it up. Charles started to speak. Eleanor could see him assembling a response, the practiced, efficient way he constructed arguments, in real time, pulling from a stockpile of observations and conclusions he had been building for months. But before he could deliver it, a man named Douglas stepped forward from the edge of the nearest group. Douglas was in his mid-50s, solidly built, with the kind of face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work before he transitioned into property development. He had known Ryan for close to a decade, had done business in the same neighborhoods where Ryan had grown up, and had crossed paths with him often enough over the years to know him as more than an acquaintance. He had never been particularly close with Charles. Douglas said in a voice that didn't apologize for interrupting that he wanted to say something. He said that he had been listening all evening to a description of Ryan Carter that he genuinely did not recognize, and that since he was apparently one of the few people in the room who had known Ryan outside the context of this family, he felt it was relevant to offer a different account. He said that 3 years ago, when Douglas's contracting business was going through a rough stretch and he had to let 2 of his longest-standing employees go, Ryan had spent 4 weekends helping both of them rework their resumes and prepare for interviews, not because anyone asked him to, and not because it benefited him in any visible way, but because that was apparently what Ryan Carter did when people around him needed something he could provide. Douglas said he had never told anyone that story before because Ryan had specifically asked him not to, and he was only telling it now because he was tired of sitting quietly while an inaccurate portrait of a decent man circulated in a room full of people who deserved the accurate one. The group nearest Douglas had gone very still. Charles turned to look at him with an expression that Eleanor read as genuine surprise, not offense, not dismissal, but the particular surprise of a man confronting information that doesn't fit the model he has been working from. It was not a common expression on her father's face. She had seen it perhaps twice before in her entire life. A woman named Sandra spoke next. She had spent 15 years in commercial real estate, had built her own firm from the ground up, and had met Ryan 2 years earlier at a professional development seminar where they had ended up at the same table for 2 days of sessions. She was not someone who spoke impulsively in rooms like this. Eleanor could see that in the deliberate way she stepped forward and the careful way she chose her words. Sandra said that when her firm's junior staff had needed someone to come in informally and talk about navigating career setbacks, Ryan had driven 40 minutes across the city on a weeknight and stayed 2 hours past what anyone had expected. She had never asked him to do it again because she could see it cost him time he didn't have, but he had offered. She said she was mentioning it not to make a case, but to add to the record, because the record being constructed in this room tonight was incomplete. The room absorbed both of these accounts without rushing to respond. Nobody filled the silence with commentary or qualification. Charles was standing in the middle of the ballroom, and Eleanor watched him experience something she had not seen him experience publicly before, the specific discomfort of a man who has stated a conclusion with total authority and is now being shown item by item that his evidence was assembled incorrectly. It was not humiliation, not yet. It was something more interior than that, the quiet vertigo of a fixed belief beginning to tilt on its axis. Eleanor spoke then. She had not planned what she was going to say, but the words came clearly the way things come when you have been holding them for long enough that they have found their own shape. She told her father that she had never needed him to love Ryan the way she loved Ryan. She said she understood that Charles measured people by a different scale, that the scale had worked for him and had produced real things: the company, the name, the room full of people who trusted his judgment. She said she wasn't arguing against the scale itself. She was saying that Ryan didn't fit the scale, and the scale not registering him did not mean he wasn't there. She said that what she had found in Ryan was something she had grown up in this family, never seeing a person who showed up without an agenda, who was honest without using honesty as a weapon, who had been through genuine difficulty and come out of it without bitterness or entitlement. She said she would rather have that than anything the Whitmore name could attach to it, and she wanted her father to understand that this was not a young woman's impulsive claim. It was a considered position. It was what she had chosen and what she would continue to choose. Charles did not respond immediately. He stood with his hands loose at his sides and his eyes on his daughter, and for a long stretch of seconds, the room was quiet enough that the distant sound of the city outside the windows was audible faint traffic, the low hum of a city going about its ordinary business beneath the weight of what was happening in this room. Eleanor watched her father's face and waited. When Charles finally spoke, his voice was different, not broken. Charles Whitmore did not break, but quieter, and with something underneath it that Eleanor recognized as the register he used when he was speaking from somewhere undefended. He said that he had spent his entire career learning how to read people. He said he had been wrong before on deals and partnerships and alliances, and that being wrong at that scale had cost him money and time and, in some cases, relationships that mattered. He said he had developed a system for reducing that kind of error, and that the system had become, over time, the primary lens through which he saw everything and everyone. He said that it was possible, he said it slowly, as if testing the weight of it, that he had made this particular assessment without enough information, and that the information he had allowed himself was shaped by what he wanted to confirm, rather than what was actually there. It was not a full admission. It was not a dramatic reversal. It was a man with enormous pride, taking one precise, deliberate step toward a position he had never occupied before in this room or any other. And Eleanor understood that for Charles Whitmore, that step was an almost unreasonable thing to ask of him, and he was taking it anyway. Ryan said that he didn't need an apology. He said it quietly, not as a dismissal, but as a genuine statement of his current needs, which were apparently modest even in this moment. He said he just wanted to take his wife home, if that was all right with everyone. There was a sound in the room, then not laughter, not applause, but a low collective exhale, the sound of a full ballroom releasing the tension of an evening. They had not expected to be this. Someone near the back started to applaud softly, and a few others followed, and then Charles Whitmore slowly. With the visible effort of a man overriding his own instincts, looked at his daughter, and said that he owed both of them better than what he had given this evening, and that he intended to do better. He said it looking at Eleanor, but he said it loud enough for the room to hear, and Eleanor understood that this too was intentional, that Charles would not make a private admission of something he had stated publicly. It was his own code, imperfect. But it was there. Eleanor looked at her father for a long moment. Then she crossed the distance between them and put her hand briefly on his arm, not a hug, not yet, but the beginning of a gesture, an opening left deliberately ajar. Charles put his hand over hers. He held it for a second, and then he let go. Ryan was standing a few feet away, watching both of them without expression. When Eleanor turned back to him, he offered his arm the way he always did, without ceremony, without comment, as if the ordinary gesture of walking out of a room together was the only thing worth noting about the end of the evening. She took it. They walked toward the doors at the far end of the ballroom, and the room watched them go, and the machinery of the evening, after a long moment of stillness, slowly began to move again. Some things do not resolve cleanly. Some distances close not all at once, but in small, deliberate increments, each one requiring more honesty than the last. The Whitmore family would not be repaired by one evening, and nobody in that ballroom was naive enough to think otherwise. But something had cracked open that had been sealed for too long. Not the argument, not the social performance of it, but the actual question underneath all of it. What do we owe the people we love? What does it mean to truly know someone? And how long can a man of great intelligence insist on a conclusion when the evidence keeps refusing to hold? Charles Whitmore stood in the center of his own gala and understood, perhaps for the first time in years, that the most important things he owned could not be appraised. Status earned a man a room full of people who agreed with him. Character earned something quieter and rarer, the trust of people who had seen him at his worst and stayed anyway. He had spent 40 years building one, and had nearly dismantled the other in a single evening. The accounting of that was something he would carry privately in the way that genuinely important reckonings are always carried, not announced, not resolved, but present every day in the choices a person makes about what kind of man he intends to be.